So we're going to do a little work on HTML. This is going to be just kind of a really basic introduction, and we're also going to talk about the boilerplate a little bit and some of the elements, just a real cursory overview. We'll get a little deeper down the line and I'll break down bit by bit by bit. But to start off with, we're going to look at MDN. I know I talk about them a lot. It's the Mozilla Developer Network. Super handy. This is what it looks like. You can pretty much any question or element or structure, anything you have a question about, you can pretty much type that element, whatever you're concerned about, and MDN into Google, and it's going to bring you up a few topics. It's a really large site with a lot of resources, so there may be a few, but Google does a pretty good job kicking them way up to the top. MDN's a trusted resource, so they usually shoot right up the ranks. So to start off with, we're talking about HTML today. So we're looking at hypertext markup language. So I always kind of think of the relationship between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in a few ways. You can either think of it as, if you're talking about language, HTML would be your nouns. They're the building blocks of the sentence. Your CSS is going to be adjectives. It's how things look. Can you do some CSS integrated in HTML? Yes. Even the early days of HTML, a lot of those attributes, the way things looked, were actually part of it. And there are some things you can kind of control with the way things look using your markup language, but generally you're not going to do that. Then there's JavaScript. So JavaScript's kind of like the verbs of the sentence. I've also heard people say that the whole thing's kind of like a body. HTML is the skeleton. The CSS is the skin, the stuff people actually see, and then the JavaScript's going to be your muscles or the actions. JavaScript makes things happen. It's a programming language, so that's when you're actually adding some logic and whatnot, adding some control to what's going on. There are certain things that are in CSS where you have some motion, but it's not quite the same. That's more like some simple animations, things like that. You can make some motion, but it's not really the same as actually manipulating what's going on, creating any logic, creating any flow. Kind of the same way HTML, because it's hypertext, it has links. It's going to allow you to link pages and therefore move between them. That's the fundamental basis of it. But at the same time, that's not, again, not quite the same as JavaScript and the power behind an actual programming language like JavaScript or Python. So, looking at this site, we're going to start out, it's a hypertext markup language, so that's why this isn't really a programming language. A lot of people act like it is, and that always kind of seems like sort of a beginner or newbie look at it, that you're trying to pretend it's a programming language when it's not. It's barely a coding language. It's really just creating structure to the site and also allowing you to do links between pages. Since we're really looking at the World Wide Web is kind of a relational setup between millions and millions and millions of pages. That's kind of where that's coming from. So HTML says is the basic building block of the web. It's existed longer than any of the other parts. It was created, like we talked about in the last lesson, by Tim Berners-Lee out of CERN back in 1980. That was the beginning of it. He theorized an internet-based hypertext system. So he kind of got it off the ground. Lots of people worked on it. W3C was involved. But one thing to know about HTML, it moves in kind of jagged ways as far as being updated. Over time, there's been big gaps, there's been short gaps, there's revisions where you don't really think of it as a new form of HTML. It doesn't get a new number, it's just a revision. Different things have been added. It's based on the functionality. All of these languages, any language you're using, some of them are a little older and more mature. Some of them are a little younger and can be a little wild and crazy and unpredictable. but they're all still developing as we need new technologies and we find new applications for these languages. So the next form of HTML was HTML2. That came out in 1995, so you've got about a 15-year gap there, probably 14 is more like it, from the first iteration of HTML. Then HTML3 came out in 1997, so did HTML4. So you had two versions come out within roughly a year of each other. There was a 2-year gap. And then it wasn't until 2014 that HTML5 came out. HTML5's had tons of iterations, tons of revisions, a lot of work done on it. That's obviously a really big gap there. You got 7 years on that one. But you got a lot of extra power out of HTML5. You were starting to see the beginnings of semantic markup in 4. And we're going to talk about semantic markup a lot. Accessibility is a big passion of mine, making sure people who are using screen readers, different assistive technologies, have access to the internet. We should all be able to use it, and sometimes it's just as simple as switching a word here and there in your tags to make it so that everybody can use it. And also remember that if your HTML isn't semantic, if you're not using good HTML and keeping it up to date, you're essentially making people blind to the web. Now, they can read books. We have Braille. We've made those kinds of steps, but it always kind of frustrates me when I see websites, even from like large companies, where they're still using tags that aren't semantic. They're using divs instead of sections. It's just a little twist. So don't get too overwhelmed with this. That's just kind of something that was pertinent as far as HTML5 coming out. There's also other things. We'll get deeper into it later, but we're just kind of getting started here. So let's look at some tags. Right here, you're going to see some of the really basic tags that are just kind of these are kind of the basis for HTML. HTML is built out of elements. I always kind of think of them as like building blocks or Legos. You make the whatever, the car, Millennium Falcon, whatever Lego kit you're doing, you're making it out of individual blocks. And that's the same thing that happens when we're building a web page. We're using all of these different elements to make something. A lot of them are just part of a boilerplate. Some of them are just really specific to text. Some of them are content, looking at like image and canvas, iframe, video. Some of them are making lists that we later format different ways. There's ordered lists and unordered lists, and then list items. Some of them it's as simple as a paragraph right here, or breaking up a section using a div and section. So that's basically what you're working with HTML. There's also going to be a lot of these are things we've been talking about where you're going to see them. They're actual things that show up on the page and give structure to the page. But there's other things that aren't part of the page as far as what we see, but are still HTML. That's largely going to be metadata, and that's going to be stored in the head. So that's all the stuff that, like a title for the page, that's where you're going to put your links that are going to connect your CSS and your JavaScript up to it. Some people put JavaScript in the body. I do personally. I've always had better luck with it at the bottom, but not important right now. But there's all kinds of metadata that can be included, even little icons. If you want a little favicon, a lot of people notice these and don't notice them. These little favicons up at the top. Even this little bit of title right here. Also on Google, all of that's going to come from, all of that Google info is going to come from the metadata. Let's look up puppies. Cool. So some of this might be metadata right there. This is all metadata. This is all going to be up there. This is stuff you're not seeing on the actual web page most likely. A lot of this is stuff that's actually put up there and meant to be fed into both your browser and also search engines to be used elsewhere. Occasionally, if there is no metadata, they might have on Google like a little bit at the beginning of the web page, but more likely this stuff's actually coming from the metadata. So that's that.